All right, so Gabriel had recruited a lot of people. A slave by the name of King said, "I was never so glad to hear anything in my life. I'm ready to join them at any moment. I could slay the white people like sheep." So by August of 1800, Gabriel's army was ready to go. And they had a pretty good plan, except for um, the weather did not cooperate. So they had planned to take Norfolk and Petersburg, except for torrential rain and other issues caused the rebels to postpone their attacks. And by this time, a few slaves started cracking under pressure from their masters as word kind of started getting out. Um, the governor, or Governor Monroe of Virginia, was notified, and state militia was called before they had a chance to carry out their plan. 30 slaves were jailed and tried without jury. And by September 11th, Gabriel was still at large, and white Virginians were absolutely horrified that something to the scale could have happened. And he almost escaped. He swam to a ship where he knew the people on board, but he did have an acquaintance on this particular ship who recognized him and alerted white authorities of his presence on board. They were offering a $300 reward, and that was enough for this guy to buy his freedom. And he thought that if he turned in Gabriel, that he could get the $300, buy his freedom, and move on, except they gave him $50. They didn't give him the full 300, they gave him $50, and on October 10th, Gabriel was hung. So there were some rebellions that were trying to kick off, but they really just didn't make it very far. Not to the obviously to the scale that we saw in Haiti. But Jefferson in office, there was a certainly a concern each time we saw a new president come in, because power typically does not transfer from one ruler to the next without without an uprising, and people were quite concerned about that. And there's this just general paranoia about this experimental government, anyways. And Americans genuinely feared that it was going to fail. And Jefferson did buy into that. And he used kind of an anti power to exercise complete control over the government. And so he was very concerned that a few things did not happen, which was aristocracy. He did not want to see a monarchy emerge at all. He was concerned about luxury, and he was also very concerned about corruption. While Washington was a very charismatic leader, Jefferson was anti-charismatic. And he really did love simplicity. He promoted the idea of what was called Republican simplicity. And like he had very nice clothing, but he preferred his own brown breeches and a simple shirt. He spoke very softly and gently, and he was very refined. He actually hated aristocracy so much that he had a newspaper, which was the National Gazette, and in 1792 he launched a 6-month campaign against Martha Washington. And I mean, he attacked Washington also, but especially Martha's events. He really hit her hard, and he said that they were too queenly. That the levees were number 2 in the 10 warning signs of a creeping monarchy and aristocracy. He was not impressed with political women and found women's participation in politics just shocking. And he abhorred women who mixed in gatherings of men. I mean, he just did not like that. And um he really did make very few public appearances. He actually would have his speeches read in Congress by a messenger rather than going and attending himself. But he was very unique. Jefferson, whereas Martha Washington served as George Washington's lightning rod, because he was a longtime widower, he had to be both president and first lady. So therefore, Jefferson was very prone to hearing gossip, And because of the way he dressed, he was often mistaken for a servant or a visitor to the White House. One lady recorded in her diary that on her first encounter with the president, she did not realize who he was. And he made her so comfortable to speak with that she confided all sorts of things. She was horrified when someone later told her, or when someone later announced him as president of the United States at dinner. So, but Jefferson was a very, very smart individual, and Washington City was Jefferson's brainchild. Ironically, he did not like cities. Jefferson envisioned, though, this new capital as being a new city on a hill. That it should be a shining example of a Republican society for the rest of the world to emulate. He was a visionary, and one contemporary stated that he loved to dream with his eyes open. He also, so he had a new way of really trying to promote Republican ideals. He was behind building, the first White House. He also was very interested in, oh, this one you can see, this is one of his blueprint drawings on how he thought Washington City should be and what the capital should look like. But he was also very interested in expansion. And territorial expansion was one pivotal part of Jefferson's politics. The federal government, that he argued that the federal government should gain capital from land purchases rather than taxation. So, therefore, he reduced the army by a third. He limited the navy to 6 ships. He abolished federal taxes on population basis. He abolished the tax on whiskey, so that whole whiskey rebellion thing, that tax that was put on the whiskey, he abolished that. And he thought that government revenue should come from customs duties and sale of Western land. So, custom duties are basically a tariff or a paid tax by importing goods from overseas. So, he didn't want to see the individual people taxed too much for things. And, but in order to make revenue from land, you have to have that land. So, the U.S. needed more land. There was very little that was natural or predestined about the process of territorial expansion in the United States. Even prior to the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, illegal settlers expected the U.S. government to protect them no matter what. And it was driven by a very large population, and most were moving west, whether the U.S. owned the land or not. And that goes back to the whole Fort Washington thing, the whole that whole deal that kicked off wars and everything else. But individual ownership of family farms was a cherished ideal which most Americans aspired for. And U.S. citizens were remarkably mobile compared to their European counterparts. And keep in mind that the Indians were here first, and they were the original occupants of the land. And after years of warfare and failed treaty negotiations with the Northwest Indian tribes, the Indians still continued to fight for the land that they saw as being rightfully theirs. And this included like the Iroquois, the Huron, the Shawnee, the Delaware. And so Jefferson looks toward the Louisiana Purchase. Now, he took a very dramatic step toward his Empire of Liberty when he purchased Louisiana Territory from France in 1803. And you can see in the purple there the land that I'm talking about. And he arranged a congressional funding for a secret scientific and military mission into Indian Territory. Jefferson felt that the Republican ideal was so important that it should run a vast empire. And he felt that the people that were in these areas could be easily integrated into the Republican type of government. But he also felt that it was God's will that expansion occur. Now, I do want you to pay particular attention to that. this whole notion that's going to go with westward expansion, every time that they do something to the Native Americans, every time they expand the territory, it is always going to go with these ideas that it was God's will that this happened. People are so incredibly religious at this time in many ways that if you can say it's God's will, then that gives you a purpose, that gives you kind of that okay that we do this kind of thing. So those two things will always fall hand in hand. I mean, if you look at the concepts of manifest destiny, that's what the whole thing is: God's divine right that the United States expand. So the Louisiana Purchase doubled the size of the United States, and it set a precedent for presidential actions in the interest of expansion. Federalists absolutely objected to this purchase. They said that it could include a host of dangers. It could possibly diversify the culture so much that there could be a problem. And now this was a French territory. They're already kind of struggling to form their own unique culture, and now that's going to be diversified, and maybe the language, the values, and those experiences of prosperity aren't going to be shared anymore. So a lot of people looked at this, that adding this huge territory could jeopardize the prosperity. And if you look at Rome as an example, that is one of the things that caused the collapse of Rome. And another problem with taking the French territory is the people that are there are French, which means they are Catholic. Not only are they Catholic, but many of them were racially mixed. And many thought that democracy might collapse under the weight of such potentially corruptible voters. But it did not guarantee the U.S. sovereignty, and the exact boundaries of the territory was unclear, and the U.S. believed that it expanded to Texas and portions of New Mexico. Spain claimed that, because you've got the Spanish territory there, Spain claimed that the purchase covered only a small strip of land west of the Mississippi, and Britain just openly questioned the legality of the entire purchase. So one thing that happens is is Jefferson sends Lewis and Clark out in around 1803, and Meriwether Lewis was 28 years old, and he was Jefferson's secretary. There's a very interesting book written about the Lewis and Clark expedition that really does talk about that friendship between Meriwether Lewis and Thomas Jefferson, and they really did have. They had known each other for years and years and years. And Lewis was put as the head of the expedition, and William Clark was the co-leader. He was chosen by Lewis, and he was from Kentucky. And he was actually a veteran of the 1790s Indian Wars, and they took with them a crew of about 45 men. And their goals were to investigate the Indian cultures, collect plants, animal specimens, chart the geography of the West, scout for potential military posts, negotiate for trade agreements, identify river routes. A lot of people were convinced there was a river route that ran from the East Coast to the West Coast. And in the spring of 1805, they were accompanied by Sacagawea. And this became very important because if you think all the way back to the settlement of Jamestown, one of the problems that occurs there is there's so many men, and they fortify themselves. They right off the bat look very threatening. They look like they're there for no good. If you take a woman with you across this, you don't look as threatening when you come across. It doesn't look like a military force coming out. So, and Sacagawea's knowledge of the Indian culture helped Lewis and Clark tremendously. And back to the idea of having a female, no woman ever accompanied a war party of Indians. So, this would help the tribes see them as non-threatening. She knew several languages, and it made her an excellent translator. They reached the Pacific Ocean in 1805, and they returned home as heroes. We'll pick up there next time.